Okay, this portion of today's teaching is on apostolic succession. My name's Paul Pavao. I'm from Rose Creek Village. You can find our website at www.rosecreekvillage.com. I have just got done doing a teaching on whether there was a pope in the early church. I hope you'd be willing to look at that as well. But I want to address specifically the issue of apostolic succession, which is mentioned in the early church writings. I'm going to tell you again, the early church we're talking about is the time from the era of the apostles, which ended around AD 70, even though the apostle John lived longer than that, until the time of the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, a period of about 250 years. Apostolic succession is mentioned during the 2nd century, and I want to talk about what they talked about because it's very interesting. Apostolic succession today to Catholic churches generally means that Peter was given authority from Jesus in Matthew 16. Upon this rock I'll build my church, and I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And so they believe that apostolic succession was the handing on of authority, that Peter took the keys of the kingdom of heaven and handed it on to the Bishop of Rome, which is who the Pope is. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome. And he handed that on, and that bishop passed it on to the next bishop. And as a matter of fact, every church has some form of apostolic succession. And apostolic succession to the Roman Catholic churches means that some sort of authority got passed on from one bishop to the next bishop to the next bishop. I want to show you what the early church really said about apostolic succession, because they did talk about it. Now, the reason that they talked about it is the Gnostics, who were people that in some way got their teachings from some portion of the scriptures or from something that they said the apostles taught, and so in some sense called themselves Christians or believed that they received a spirit from Jesus, and so in that sense they called themselves Christians. But they taught bizarre things almost across the board. They taught that the God of the Old Testament was a created and incompetent God who shouldn't have created the world, and that there was a New Testament God different from him who came to redeem the world, and in whatever way the Gnostics represented that New Testament God's message, which was always completely different from the early church's message. Gnosticism actually means knowledge, and they base their teachings on obtaining some knowledge that would allow them to go to their form of heaven. In the first century, most Gnostics were inside of the church. And in Paul's letter to the Corinthians and John's letter, you find them dealing with issues that were brought up by Gnostics. Paul talks about people who taught that there was no resurrection. John talks about people who taught that Jesus Christ didn't come in the flesh. In the book of Revelation, in the letters to churches in Revelation 2 and 3, we read that there were people who were teaching God's servants, Christ's servants, to commit immorality and to eat things that were sacrificed to idols. These were Gnostics inside of the church. But in the early 2nd century, those Gnostics were put out of the church, but still often the churches were competing with them. The Gnostics were the cults of the 2nd century. And there were books written against the Gnostics by 2nd century Christians. One complete book that was written is called Against Heresies by Irenaeus. Irenaeus was a very important bishop of the late 2nd century, but in the late 2nd century he wrote in around AD 185, and he would have been at least in his 60s, because in his early years he said he had been taught by Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna. Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, was bishop from sometime around AD 100 to about AD 155 when he was martyred at the age of 86. He had been appointed to his position by the Apostle John. So you have John who taught Polycarp, Polycarp who taught Irenaeus, and so Irenaeus was a very well-respected bishop. It was already AD 185. Most of the apostles had been dead for at least 100 years, and here's a guy who knew somebody who knew the apostles. So he was very important. There was also a lawyer from North Africa, from Carthage, by the name of Tertullian, who wrote a letter to the emperor, and those letters to the emperors are known to us as apologies, and his letter is called Apology. And apology means a defense, and it's a defense of the Christians written to the emperor going, why are you persecuting us? And if you are going to persecute us, please do so on good reasons, not because of rumors that you've heard about us. And so the apology was written to explain what Christianity was and to dispel some of the rumors about Christians. We learn some things from those kind of letters. Tertullian also wrote a treatise called the Prescription Against Heretics. It's also called the Demurrer Against Heretics. Demurrer is a legal term, and it's almost like a legal brief that gets given to a court. He was a lawyer, so he wrote a legal brief against the heretics. In these arguments against the heretics, both Irenaeus and Tertullian used two forms of arguments against them. One, they used an argument from the Scriptures. They went, here's what the Scriptures really teach, and that's how we know what the apostles taught, and the apostles know what Jesus taught because Jesus taught the apostles. So you have Jesus teaching the apostles who wrote the New Testament Scriptures, and here's my argument from the Scriptures that what the Gnostics believe is not true. That was one form of argument that they used. It's the form of argument that we would use today against groups we don't agree with, like say the Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, the Way International, groups like that we evangelicals, born-again Christians, tend to call cults. The other form that the early church used was an argument from what's known as apostolic tradition. They had something we can't have. The apostles taught the church leaders at Rome, at Ephesus, at Antioch, at Philippi, at Corinth, at Alexandria. They appointed leaders, they handed them a body of truth and said, teach these things and make sure you don't ever change those things because this is the basic truths that the church needs to hold on to. And those leaders appointed new leaders to replace them as they got older. And those leaders were given the same body of truth and were told to preserve it and pass it on. And it goes on and on like that until the time of Irenaeus in AD 185. And he would be able to show a very short succession. John to Polycarp to me. Tertullian, who was not a bishop or an elder, talked about it happening in the churches, and he went, hey, you can go to the church at Ephesus, you can go to these apostolic churches, and they will pull out a roll of bishops and go, John taught Polycarp, Polycarp taught this person taught this person, all the way down to our time, and all the apostolic churches can do that. And he went, that is proof that what the apostles taught was held on to by us, not by you. Can you guys do the same thing? And to them, this was the argument of apostolic succession. The Roman Catholics really like to use what Irenaeus wrote to go, hey, Irenaeus believed what we believed. He believed that Peter taught a bishop in Rome truth and handed on the keys of the kingdom to him, and that bishop handed on to the next bishop, and those bishops were the Pope. They were allowed to rule over all the church. They're the vicar of Christ on earth, and that was true from the very beginning. And one of the proofs that we offer to it is what Irenaeus wrote. Irenaeus said there was apostolic succession in the Church of Rome, and in fact he did. But he did it for the reasons that I just described. He did not do it for the reasons that the Roman Church today describes. So I'm going to read that to you. Here's what he said. And again, I want you to catch that he has already said, as a matter of fact, I'll read it to you. He has already said this about the Gnostics. When the Gnostic heretics are refuted by the Scriptures, they turn around and accuse these same Scriptures as if they are not correct nor of authority, and assert that they are ambiguous. So that's how the heretics ignored the Scriptures. He goes, yet again, now we go to our second argument, yet again, when we refer them to that tradition which originates from the apostles, which is preserved by means of the succession of elders and churches, they object to tradition, saying that they are wiser, not merely than the elders, but even than the apostles. So that was the Gnostic refutation. They went, well, we know more than the elders do in your churches. As a matter of fact, we know more even than the apostles do. That was the refutation that they gave. But I don't want you to catch their refutation. I want you to catch his argument. He says, we refer them to that tradition which originates from the apostles, which is preserved by means of the succession of elders, not one bishop, elders, in the churches. It's preserved everywhere in the apostolic churches, not just in Rome.